year 2, 4, and 6. We want to make sure that we, track what the impacts are if we make these changes. How does it better the environment? How does it better
You're gonna get rid of that.
want me to get rid of this?
No, that's good. I'll get rid of
So here, urgency, I already talked a little bit about it, but I want to reiterate, source drinking water for West Auburn. Lake Auburn, high water quality has entitled the Auburn Water District waiver from the EPA, one of only 10 water utilities in Maine. But that's good. That means less cost for the proposed here in Lewiston, Auburn. Not only less cost, but better for the environment, better for you as a person drinking water. So that's good. Then the urgency, we talked a little bit about this already. Outside pressures, LD 1884, really kind of limits the income standards, any parcel in the state. So what we have for income standards now for ag and resource protection, that potentially could go away. 1312 is really adding additional LD 1312 adds additional homes. So if you meet the standard for a legal size lot, it's legally conforming, you can put accessory dwelling, more pressure on the watershed. So we want to be able to have the best defense for a system in the watershed. And then lack of housing opportunity. This is not the focus of this particular presentation, but there is a lack of housing opportunity in Maine. I was talking to a friend of mine last night. He's a realtor. And, pre-pandemic, there was 500 new homes, parcels of land coming for sale a day. 500. Today, it's 90. And the pressure from additional people homes is greater. So everybody's trying to find a piece of land. Everybody's trying to find a home live in, and it's just a lot of pressure. So yeah, with these pressures coming in, we want to be able to do the best we can to protect the watershed. Then lastly, we're talking about lots of older development lots without watershed protection. So there's over 300 septic systems in the watershed, and 275 of those are grandfathered based on the time period they were installed prior to 1983. So they don't need to meet the current standards that we have for our watershed. They don't need to meet that 36 inches horizontal separation for the septic design, for the limiting factor, and then the 2-foot separation for the actual installation of the field. So we'll go over that and what the impacts of that. This is kind of a snapshot. This is from the 2012 Lake Auburn Water District. This is what this is a turbidity NTUs. It's basically what NTUs is measure refracted light in water in the water column. So if you real clear water, like a Poland spring bottle of water is 0, right? And you take some mud or something like that, and put that in the water, shake it around. It could be an NTU of 10 or 100. So this is showing that 1997, the readings were less than 1. Yeah. And as time has progressed, as we had the current information that we have for our ordinance, you can see that our line, our trajectory is not going in the right direction. The NTUs are getting, we're gonna take questions at the end of the presentation. But the projection is going up. Nothing. So if we can say that if we keep it status quo, I think we can understand where we're going to be in another 10 years. I think we'll be over that 5 NTU units measurement. That 5 is where you lose the weight, potential of losing the weight. So, you know, we're on that trajectory that's not the greatest. I think that part of that is probably potentially, as we look at the watershed, it's the existing systems that are out there. That's part of the impact. So this is a way to address it. So again, here's a look of what we have for systems out there. We have a total of 321 systems out there. Of that, 275 systems only need to meet the subsurface wastewater rules at 12 inches or 9 inches, right? So these systems, if they're failing, they only have to meet the state standard. They don't necessarily have to meet the new standard. So we lose an opportunity of fixing those systems and fixing it in terms of impacting the lake and water. But the good part of this, here's some map of the watershed. This line here represents the watershed, right? And what we're looking at in green and some in orange are protected portions of land in the watershed. And that's good information. Those are lands that are forever protected by the Auburn Water District. And those are great protections. When we talk about development pressures, these areas forever will be protected. And that's good. So these are some of the reports. This is where we've got some of the vision studies from Lake Auburn phase 1, the diagnostic study of Lake Auburn phase 2, Lake Auburn watershed management plan, and then latest plan was from regulatory, environmental, and economic analysis of water supply from Lake Auburn that was done by the City of Auburn just recently. These are some of the recommendations that align with the 2010. The line of septic systems regulations contained in the Lake Auburn watershed ordinance with the best available science and Maine septic system regulations. We're going to introduce what we think is the best science in this particular case. Develop a clear set of standards for farm management that will limit phosphorus loading commercial activities. We're looking at increasing the buffer. And we'll go over some of the specific language that we're proposing to the planning board next week in a workshop. Incorporate low impact development requirements for new single family residential homes. We're already doing that. So currently right now, we have a phosphorus ordinance in the Taylor Pond watershed and the Auburn Lake watershed. And we can't implement necessarily the best practices, best management practices because of the current phosphorus ordinance we have. We had to update. So we're taking information that was dated from 1997, and now we've updated it. It's already been passed by the planning board and then on to the council for a vote, hopefully next week. But we're introducing the new 2016 BIP standard. And that will allow the implementation of low impact development. What is that? What is LID technique? LID techniques, and then we'll show you some examples, but it's really point source treatment. It's taking a big watershed area, breaking it up into little subcatchments everywhere, and doing point source treating that particular location. Right? It's quickly getting that water where it all gathers in one area rather than treating it in a big pond. We're treating it in little low impact development techniques, little rain gardens, drip edges, little things that get the water quickly into the ground. we'll look at that a little bit. Other recommendations. Cities to increase density in other parts of the community. We're proposing right now in the city, 1,600 additional acres in the urban residential area become basically form-based code. Those require additional density. Those are areas where sewer and water is already available. And we're saying, hey, let's grow from the city's core outwards, right? So we're targeting that's the core of the city as a develop, basically as a growth area. So we've already proposed that to the planning board. We're going to continue to do that on Tuesday. So that's another area. We want to pull that pressure from the upper watershed on the north part of the city. We want to put more of the development pressure in the core of the city where we can handle it. We want to foster a working relationship with stakeholders, including the Auburn Water District, Lewiston Water Districts in these conversations. Council, the planning board, public, and letting people know and having an open conversation as to what the best course of action should be. We want to continue to support small watercrafts and continue to support implementation of best management practices. We really want to try to incorporate low impact development techniques throughout the city. That's going to be, as we have more developers and more development pressures coming in, we want to talk to the engineers and really introduce that type of treatment, point source treatment, rather than putting everything in a giant stormwater pond and calling it good. The city should support local youth conservation, summer conservation. There's no better way of educating our young people out there with the job of, well, what does a rain garden look like? Let's build one. What does a good buffer look like? Let's build one. And use it as an example and create a good story in the paper that everybody can read about, learn a little bit about what is best management practice. I can say personally that, my major in college was environmental science. And the reason why I got involved was that because back in 1990, however many years ago that was, I was the youth conservation. I learned about it. It driven me to, go into a career that's environmental. And then lastly, the city recommends larger lot frontage in low country density residential. That's coming out of the comp plan, 2021 comp plan. That just means less development. A lot of those lots are found in the upper region of the So here's some of the specific language. Just want to go over it with you that we're proposing. And so one is we want to do, rather than having 36 inches for limiting factor, we do want to limit it to 12 inches. When I talk about the limiting factor, from a scientific standpoint or from a soil scientist or a site evaluator standpoint, is that's where the seasonal high water table is. Okay, so 12 inches to the seasonal high water table. The state standard is 9 inches. We're saying 12 here, right? And that seasonal high water table, and Dave can talk a little bit more clear on this than I can, but it's basically the standing of soils where you recognize as a licensed site evaluator where that seasonal high water table comes up to. Right? So we want to make sure we maintain 12 inches. That. So then what we want to do is we want to add another 24 inches of material to that. So you have a natural 12-inch layer, and then potentially another 24 inches of introduced material. So you're really gonna have that 30, you're gonna again retain that 36 inches. Right? But here's the big one, number 3. All private sewage disposal systems replacement or new shall meet the specification in section 1. Right? So everybody in the Auburn water district, in the Auburn watershed, the Lake Auburn watershed, everybody has to have 36 inches. So what that means is everybody has the same system. Those grandfather systems we talked about earlier, those 275 systems, if they need a replacement system, we're changing the ordinance that everybody has. So we have a chance to correct all those additional fields that are in the watershed.
You want questions later, but just clarify, you have to upgrade it.
At the time you have to replace, correct? So, and then secondly, we talked a little bit about pest management practices, curtain drains. I designed a lot of systems, engineered systems in the Belgrade Lakes region. When I worked at an engineering firm, they were all engineered systems, but they were all lakefront systems. And it was around basically big camps, big youth camps, high number of kids, high volumes of effluent at certain times of the year during the summer. You know, you'd have no use, and then all of a sudden there's 600 kids there using the system, right? So we had to build systems that really are protected. And every one of those systems, those fields, they had a curtain drain. What a curtain drain is if I could draw a picture, so you've got a slope, right? And all water could come here and you have a field that kind of looks like this. On the up gradient side, you would put basically a pipe in the ground that picks up all the groundwater that's going to impact that field. So we're protecting that investment. So every one of the systems that we're talking about now in the watershed would have this best management practice. We want to take the groundwater away from the field. We want to take the ability, any additional pressures on that system away. So there are exceptions, right? All private sewage disposal systems shall be installed on the lot on your unit, unless the system can be developed outside the watershed. So basically, what we're trying to say here, in a nutshell, is that if we can put the system and it's not on somebody else's land, right? You can do it outside the watershed. But if you don't have wrecked soils on your property, you can't do a mega system someplace else. We've had that situation where, you know, they've had a septic farm in the watershed where they've got a whole bunch of land. They might have 10 lots. None of those lots meet the subsurface wastewater standards of the city's ordinance of 36 inches, but 1,000 feet down the road they do. And then they put all individual systems over there and concentrate on that lot. That's going to be a no-go if this ordinance passes, right? We want to make sure if that lot, you have a legal lot and you can build on it, then that system needs to go there. If you can't meet the requirement there, then there is no law. There is no buildable lot. We don't want to concentrate the phosphorus, the nitrates, nitrogen in a particular area. And then secondly, part of that is the replacement system, right? We know there's many lots out there that are small and they're hard to do this replacement system. It may be very difficult. And you might have fill extensions, may not have enough land. But in this particular case, we're really looking at, you know, doing the best we can on that particular lot if it's a replacement system. So there will be some adjustments on that. There's some language on it, not showing up. But there is some additional language on there, of small lots replacement systems. We can make some adjustments under the advisement of the licensed site evaluator. There'll be a chance for some adjustments if the lot is difficult to. The next piece is this phosphorus ordinance. We talked a little bit about this, and this is just really being able to use the latest phosphorus control manual of March of 2016. Currently, right now, our ordinance is the 1997 model. So LID techniques wasn't even around then. Everything went to buffers. We know we have a lot of small lots. To do a good phosphorus treatment for buffers, you need the land. So, you know, how phosphorus treatment typically is done on a bigger lot is that, you know, you centralize all the water, then you put it down a ditch, and then you basically install this rock contraption called the level lift spreader. Centralizes the water, and then it takes it all, and then it spreads it out, and then it treats it over a large buffer area, forested buffer or metal buffer or something. Based on the soil type, the buffer gets sized. Based on the soil type, the coefficient of the slope, all kinds of different things that get involved with that. But, that's typically how you treat phosphorus. But on the new ordinance, in the new technical manual, they introduced low impact development rather than before. And there's a couple of examples of LID. Grassy swales, vegetated swales, bioswales. Those all have a media that's underneath the grass there, that basically, and piping where the water drains down through and then gets piped out to daylight. Something. So there's a treatment to that, and there's retention. Right? Same thing with rain gardens. Some of the rain gardens may actually just hold water there, and then some of it leaches down, depending on how. So a lot of this septic design standards, you know, came out of that Lake Auburn study in 2021. So that's just really the recommended septic design standard, maintaining a requirement for a minimum depth of 36 inches of drain layer, groundwater or bedrock. So this is where we, Dave, this is where we got that from the study. There's been some, and I'm going to kind of introduce this tonight. There's been some discussion, and as we go through the design, and Dave talks a little bit about soils and how treatment happens, and how the biology works of all this. But right now, today, we have a 36 inches horizontal separation for that limiting factor. We talked about limiting factor. With the install of the system, you only have to maintain 24 inches. So you could set that system in the ground at 1 foot. So if you did it for today's standard, you're only maintaining a 24 horizontal separation. Seasonal high water. Well, let's move on to slide. I'll let Dave talk a little bit about the soils, and we'll go back into the lines.
Good evening, folks. Yep. Such an exciting. Just like to introduce who I am and where I come from. I spent 36 years working in the state. 3 of those were in the state septic system program, where I licensed people in the septic system. 34 years. My job was soil and water conservation, hired by the Maine Soil and Water Conservation Commission, folded into the Department of Agriculture, but all those duties continued, and they're doing those things. And soil and water conservation is a passion of mine. Paid to be here. I do get some compensation, but I believe in this. I understand it. I studied it for many, many years. I've been a licensed site evaluator since 1976. And I designed outright on subsurface wastewater rules. So it's a subject that I'm very familiar with. So I provide that. And back, I think it was about 15 years ago, I came and spoke to, I don't know if it was the planning board, Watershed District, City Hall, concerned about one of the requirements that basically mandated that septic systems be installed, put into the ground. And with a 36-inch depth to limiting factor requirement, that pretty much meant that you had to design septic systems with sand and gravel. Very, very important. And back beginning days of this designing septic systems, we had a perk test. The whole idea was to get rid of the water. Wanted to get rid of it because it's out of the ground. People knew that people got sick, so get rid of it. And that's why we had a perk test. Over time, we understood a little bit more about treatment or renovation. And so there's been a leap forward in our understanding. And so that requirement that all septic systems be installed 12 inches minimum in the ground and have 36 inches of limiting factor, and going to put systems down into the soil. I do have some slides. I don't know where they are. I don't know where they are. Anyway, while they're searching for that, I do want to emphasize that in almost all of our soils, the layer of soil that's the most biologically active is for 6 inches to 12 inches. That's where the microbes are, plant roots, and that sort of stuff. They will use up a lot of what's in that wastewater that somewhere else. Stick it in the ground, particularly sand and gravel soil. Nothing there for plant roots, microbes, or anything. So there's no treatment of the wastewater. That's actually counter to what I do understand that there is having this requirement makes it more difficult to find suitable sites for storage growth. But I've always made the argument that limiting growth should be on the basis of the overall suitability of a property to attenuate and treat runoff and other. So, and one of the other things I want to just briefly mention is that when somebody says, say, 36 inches of the seasonal groundwater table, everybody thinks about that as being kind of the same thing. I can assure you that the groundwater table and the clay soil, groundwater table and the sand is a whole world of difference. Clay soils, as you know, are very, very tight. So if you have a little bit of water in it, it's on a flat piece of ground, water can't go anywhere, so it sits. What site evaluators do when they look at a soil profile and try to determine where is the seasonal groundwater table sufficiently above it, they look for things in the soil that's called modeling, little spots, yellow, red, brown, red. What happens in the soil is that if the soil is saturated long enough for all the oxygen to be used up in soil water, microbes still need oxygen. So what they do is they take process switches, take the oxygen. When they do that, the ion becomes mobile. Then when the water table drops, the air hits it, wherever it went, it crushes again, and where it left, it's red. So look at these spots. So in a clay soil, you say, okay, there's a groundwater. But if your septic system is too close to it, it just means there's no place for the water to go. That's the biggest issue. You're not contaminating groundwater tables. Any consequence. If you've got a highly permeable soil with a water table, that can move very easily. That's a whole different story. That water is going somewhere in a hurry. It's going to probably affect somebody anyway. So just the fact that there's a groundwater table doesn't tell you the whole story. And the ordinance you have currently forces you to go into sandy gravelly soils, which have basically an aquifer as compared to these other climate protection soils. So this is an example of the soil profile that's gravel. In almost all cases in the state of Maine, the gravelly soil is deposited by a flowing glacial river or stream or something like that. The glacier is melted, and there's no more water, and it had a chance to develop like it does. But in the time it took from when the glaciers first receded and they became vegetated, it was hundreds of years. There was a lot of wind-blown material. So almost all of them, if you look there, you'll see there's a loamy layer on top of that soil profile. So that's where all the biologic activity is. That's where plant roots and everything are. They're not going to go down into that gravel. There's nothing there. So in sandy and gravelly soil, I have say in the matter. I say put that system on top of it. Don't put it in the ground. On top. You're going to get treatment from that fine textured material. And you can't get a lot of water down into the gravel if you've got something very fine. As you know, if you've got a very, very fine mesh, and then you've got something that's a bigger mesh underneath it, bigger mesh means nothing because you're going to get through the little mesh to get to the big. Same idea. You get that treatment. Means you're going to have a little bit bigger septic system because the sizing of a septic system is based upon the amount of water, the rate that water can move into the soil. And in our business, we call it the long-term acceptance rate because we know there'll be particles from the septic tank that escape, go out into the leach field, there'll be microbes living in dead bodies. Those will cause a little bit of clogging. And if it's a little bit, we call that a biological mat. That's a good thing because a lot of treatment. That biologic mat gets too thick, there'll be no treatment. So you want a little bit of mat, but you don't want too much of that. So we try to design septic systems that have a big enough footprint so they can put water into the ground. Obviously, it's part of the texture of the footprint. So the size of the disposal field is bigger than you would need if you're just putting water in the ground because we know it's particles. So we're always trying to play this game of balancing. But one of the greatest, I guess, thinkings in this whole septic system business came about probably 10 years or so ago. I and a few others that I know in other states put the system on top of the ground, or very shallow. Don't put it in below the ground, the topsoil. If you have a hard pan glacial fill soil that is loamy throughout, it's not as big a deal because loamy soils you can't go through very fast. Sandy soils are a problem. So that's what we're trying to combat this whole scenario here. And this slide here shows you the soil that has a couple of horizons in it. I'll just touch upon. Dark brown layer is just, it's a topsoil or loamy layer. The bright color underneath it is what we call the B horizon. That's where a lot of iron rusting occurs and still is fairly active biologically. The olive color down below that, that's basically a hard pan. It's almost nothing. This profile here, you've only got the topsoil, then you just paint right into what's called the C horizon, which is gravel and has nothing. I put this in here just because it's our most common kind of a soil, and it has this gray leach layer. I'm not going to get into it tonight because we don't have a lot of time and keep using it. It's called a spotisol because that's from Latin meaning, or Greek from meaning from wood ash. This looks like wood ash. So basically, that's what I wanted to touch upon.
Dave. I do want to go back a couple of slides, really cover the language. The slide deck that we were working on was, unfortunately, was the first iteration without Dave, correcting some of the language. So this is the exact language that we're proposing in the planning board next Tuesday. So, and again, I think what I was saying is the same, but I just want to make sure that everybody's clear that we're introducing 24 inches of suitable natural soil fill material to result in 36-inch separation between the bottom of the disposal field and the limiting factor. So, and we're gonna get into the design and what that looks like in the profile a little bit. And then again, all disposal areas for placement shall meet design criteria. Then we talked a little bit about that we're also gonna, local plumbing inspector must evaluate the design of currents from the Auburn Water District. As we're strengthening the language of working with our partners to impart much of the design criteria. So those are those difficult systems with small lots. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll have the curtain drain, or another term that Dave introduced into this language is diversion ditch. So not only is it an underground pipe, the surface water that comes in, or you could have a combination of the two. So you could have you could have the curtain drain or and a diversion ditch, or the combination of the two. That's really based on the design professional that's decided by Highway. I just wanted to make sure that we were clear and the language is consistent between the first meeting and today's meeting. We didn't change anything. I labeled the wrong slide there. Then the all private sewage disposal system shall be installed on the lot. And we talked a little bit about this already, where we have those fields, septic farm fields on one particular lot, right? We talked about that each individual lot, we can't meet it, but over here it does. So we're bringing all the systems over there. That's not going to be allowed. That's pretty much this. So replacement disposal profile. This is what's going on today. These are systems that have been replaced, reviewed by the Auburn Water District, and it just shows that currently right now the bottom of these fields, even though this particular one here, right, this cross section, you have your limiting factor of 36 inches. And Dave, this is where I was talking about where it's still not right? So the bottom of the field is at 24 inches. So, but that's just showing that in a particular case where we have 36 inches of horizontal separation, the limiting factor, this full profile, this is where the limiting factor is. We're setting the bottom of that bed, that treatment, right? That biomat that Dave talked about is down here at 24 inches, only giving us separation of 1 foot. That on really well draining soils, that could be potentially direct nitrates going into the groundwater. Not only is it affecting our public water supply, but people in the watershed, more of those people have wells than they do public water supply. So this could be affecting their actual well. And with nitrates, phosphorus, nitrogen, those items could be entering the groundwater and entering the wells. So the current standards that we have today isn't, I would consider, a good design. Dave talked about the science. All that treatment, right, where that organic layer is, that's up here. These infiltrators, these systems, and plastic chambers should be sitting up here. This one should be up here. And we should have the fill material, introduce fill material that has the fines that's gonna additionally polish that water, treat that water. Or it enters the ground. So these are some of the things that we're addressing with this ordinance. Additionally, some more, again, another one, 36 inches. You know, the system is, we're a foot. The top of the system is a foot off the ground, into the ground. So we're not getting that horizontal separation. These are just a couple of examples that were installed 2021. 2021. Next slide. So here's the new design, right? We have the 12 inches, this line right here represents the 12 inches limiting factor. Right? That's where the seasonal high water table that meets our standard, what we're talking about. We're saying, rototill this area, dig it up a little bit, and then introduce 24 inches of media, and then put your system on top. There may be some opportunity to lessen the cost. We'll talk a little bit about cost because that's going to come up in a conversation. Well, John, how much more does it cost to put in a pump station? To put in an additional 24 inches of material, you know, that is a specified aggregate soil media that costs $48 a cubic yard. $48 a cubic yard. That's how much it costs. You may say, okay, well, the economics of it, if we build it this way, the system is going to last 20 to 30% longer. Shelf life is 20, 30 years. Improve. So, but now if we build it this way, it may be even more. So our return on investment might be pretty decent, but there's still about $2,800 of additional material there, the equipment, not including the pump station. You need to pump it up, right, to your raised bed. So there may be some room in negotiation, and we're introducing this conversation now in this workshop for the real workshop with the planning board, and we really want to get that conversation going with the planning board to maybe squeeze this down to 12 inches and still maintain that 24 inches, because right now the current design standards is 24 inches of horizontal separation if you can set that field into the ground. We'll wait for the presentation. All right. I'll think you were here. All right. So there may be some room here where we eliminate a foot of this introduced material that may minimize the need for pump stations. The grades right. So, but we're going based on that 2021 recommendation from FD Environmental. Remember that language, 36 inches horizontal separation. That's where I came up with this idea. As Dave and I talk about it and we discuss it and we think about treatment and how this works, and what we've had currently, we may be able to put this down to 1 foot of new material and minimize some of the cost. So that's part of the. Love to hear some feedback on that, pros and cons. And again, this is the upslope here, the curtain drain. We talked a little bit about that, or the dry swale, or diversion ditch, however you want to call it. You know, basically you've got. So this is a lot of this low drain soil. So you've got basically a 6 mil poly, black poly material that's on the down gradient side. You've got a 6 or 4 inch perforated pipe. The uphill side bedded in stone that picks up the groundwater. Like, we don't want that groundwater entering this investment of this field. We want to divert that. Same thing with the surface water. And we already talked about a little bit about this. Did some Dave talked about this, the Soil and Water Conservation District. I was a watershed project director in the county, did a lot of the reporting, a lot of the work that Dave foresaw, and kind of did a lot of the technical assistance as we worked with him. He's talked about best management practices, low impact development. He was our subject matter expert. As we implemented it in the field, in the watersheds, he was the guy that we would go to for technical advice as we wrote things and as we did things and as we implemented them in the ground. But we did EPA reporting for Region 5. They have a calculated sheet that you do for pre and post work. So what we're saying is that we want to do that here. And they do a good job of quantifying the phosphorus, nitrogen, the nitrates, and the sediment that's trapped on these sites. And I just ran something for Eric today on some development that we're doing potentially close to the watershed to show what the pre and post impacts are for a 148 acre development. So we have a way to quantify it. We have ways to keep track of it and see how well we're doing. Pretty much it. I'm open for questions.
Thank you for all of the information. I can raise my voice. I'm just a little confused. Can you hear me?
Yes.
When you first started, you were talking about LD 1884 and 1312 and the lack of housing. And then we're talking about the lake now, and I'm just trying to sort out how does protecting our reservoir of water have to do with the lack of housing? Is this a meshed issue, or are these two separate issues? You understand my question?
Yeah, I understand it. So, like, you know, this is really an issue about water quality of the lake right now. But there's outside pressures that that are going to push potentially development into the watershed. And what I'm saying is that this I think is our best defense, right? There may be outside. It doesn't matter what the city has an ordinance. If there's outside state saying that we're overriding any city ordinance, local ordinance. This is impact to the watershed, right? So, but this is our best defense. We're trying to get our kind of a ducks in a row for the best design standards that would protect the lake watershed, the lake itself and the water.
Okay, I understand that, and I'm all for improving septic systems if it's going to be for the sole purpose of keeping our reservoir of water safe. That makes perfect sense. I just don't understand how the pressure of the lack of housing has to do with the watershed. If we have a watershed, we want to protect our reservoir of water. The MMC depends on our water. How is it? I just don't get why those two issues are not separate issues. It just doesn't make sense that improving 275 septic systems in the effort to maintain good water quality, and then the lack of housing. Is the lack of housing is the only land we have in the watershed?
If I could speak a little bit to that too, I think that John brings those up just to highlight that there are development pressures throughout the city. There is a lack of housing throughout the state. There's more demand right now than there is supply. And we're seeing more new construction, not just in the watershed, but everywhere in the city, than we have seen in years. LD 1884 in particular targets the ability for a community to use an income requirement to make decisions on where housing is flat. And that's what we've done throughout the agricultural zone. The majority of the land in the Lake Auburn watershed, actually, because we require somebody to earn now 30% years of their income from agriculture. If that state law passes, we'll no longer be able to use that tool to make our ag zone something other than a residential zone. It hasn't done that. So I think there are a lot of potential increases in development pressure that may be beyond our control. Right now, we're really not treating wastewater in existing systems or new systems.
Is this all to support a filtration system to filter the wastewater?
Hopefully to prevent the need.
Parks Roads, I live on Lakeshore Drive. The pressure you discussed, the legislation, I understand. Pressure is legislation. Is that correct?
I know that he's been supportive of it and worked with the representative on it. As part of drafting it, but I don't think that's the only pressure. I think there are market pressures that we're facing now. Those regulatory that directly affect and the rest of the ag, but that's not the only pressure for development. That's different than it has been over decades. A lot of market pressure, everywhere, not just the
You cited the regulatory environmental. In there, didn't it? That's the small portion. So many. This sensitive. Why doesn't the city concentrating on developing those areas? Why is all the pressure?
I think we are, and John can speak to it as well. We are concentrating on creating development opportunities at the core of the city. It really is about better wastewater disposal. And I think if you look at that economic section of the report, it says that there is no net economic benefit across the two communities, but it also shows that a fair amount of the cost of that Lewiston would bear more than Auburn, and Auburn would see some net if there was. We're not proposing it, but that's what the economic. There's no net benefit across both.
I'd actually like to get back to some questions associated with our quality. I've seen some slides. I'm a former water district trustee. So the slide that you showed with the increased turbidity problems, really is something we've paid a lot of attention. In the years I was a trustee, we paid attention to that. That led up to the alum treatment, in which case those numbers came way down. And so when you look at it now, they're very low because the alum treatment was successful, but we know that won't last forever. So being proactive is really important. I think the other slides that we have seen of it, sort of companions to this slide, have to do with, so we started looking at, and the people who've done, decades of science on the lake, have been trying to understand what exactly got going on in 2002 and been really intensifying in those years. So one is that ice out dates
ice in and ice out dates have considerably changed in the last 10 years, so that the lake is not covered by ice nearly so long, and that increases the algae content, and we are at some danger of permanent algae colonies. The other is that we've had a dramatic increase in intense precipitation events in that same time period, so that the soil naturally occurred in the lake bed as well as the lake shore has high phosphate content in the soil, so that erosion in the flows of water coming down roads, coming out of gardens that are rototilled, and it rains 9 inches a day sometimes. We've had some really extraordinary rain events. That's all flowing down into streams and flowing into the lake. So septic is really only a piece of the sources. And that has led to some of the recommendations around tree cover, because that is one of the best ways to secure the roots of the trees. They're securing the soils in place so that those intense rain events don't carry as much soil with them. I'm curious about all of the multiple factors that are actually leading to that result. Septic is one. The other is that we have become quite aware that a huge amount of the phosphates coming in from the Townsend Brook, and that's coming in from Turner. So the need for this to be not just a single approach, but really a well-integrated approach to achieve the water quality that we all depend on, I think is really important. So I just put that out, that this is just one of the pieces contributing to the water quality, particularly because you see there hasn't been that kind of development in the lake watershed to explain that data. As a matter of fact, that data is related to development other places and rain events and ice out dates. So with that in mind, just as a backdrop, I just encourage everybody working on this to have a highly integrated approach, or we won't actually solve this. I'm curious, with those intense rain events that are well documented, I think Dr. Holly Ewing has a lot of good data on that. If you haven't seen that particular slide, how does that work with the new septic systems that you propose? Are they better equipped to handle big rain events?
That's the kind of conversations that we want to have, because we want to look at it holistically and identify, some additional. I think one, if we get this passed right, taking it into the upper portions of the watershed and another community, and talking to their, code enforcement, their city people that make the rules, their council or their select persons. Those types of conversations should be coming out of this. That once we have a model set up here in Auburn, we should continue moving it forward. And I can't speak. They're gonna answer my boss, but I would love to go and speak with the other community for the water district in this effort. But as Dave said, and I said before, I believe in this. And then to add a little bit about the rain piece, right? Your last question at the end, that the requirement of those curtain drains and the diversion ditches is exactly how to treat those high rain, protecting that. So that is a direct best management practice, protecting that leach field for a high rain event. So that kind of think that I don't think I can't explain it any other way, but there's no engineering or any science that protect that area better than doing that. I can tell you that 2 weeks ago, Coach me, U19 soccer team, and the other coach, his house, he's got 2 boys, they're 17 years old, they take long showers, system overloaded. He's got a big roof, big house, and it goes right into the sheet flows off the thing, and I'm like, you need to put in, you're overloading the system because of rain events, they're not, if rain has no place to go, it overloads the system. You need to put in the diversion ditch, and you need a curtain drain. So, you know, that's just an example right there, right? So that, all that impervious area, that roof, there's no place that water to go. It analyzes on the roof, sheet flows off, fields right there. There's not much time for that water to get into the ground. And it's even worse in the wintertime, because the ground's frozen, not getting into the ground. So that's just sheet flowing over and it's entering. So this is our best approach in terms of best management practices, address that particular all times of the season. As we know, climate change is happening quickly, and you know, this is talked about it in the last meeting, is, you know, we're getting a good front line together because there's all these pressures coming in. One of our best. Now to talk a little bit about canopy, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm really happy that you mentioned that, because back in the slide where we talked about changing the 1997 phosphorus standards, the LID standards of 2016. Part of the LID is putting buffers in, planting buffers in. So we're talking about, okay, if you want to do something close in the watershed, yeah, you're going to treat the water, but also we're going to make you put it in a buffer for that, right before that lake. You know, I think about Taylor Pond and all those small little lots, the impact that has on the lake, right? The community of Auburn loves Taylor Pond and all those camps in there. There's no way to treat that phosphorus with that old design, and this is the way to do it. I'm not saying there's a lot of opportunity there for Lake Auburn. There's not as much high pressure development on Lake Auburn. We're lucky about that. But when there is one, we're certainly going to introduce that from our code enforcement level, my level, reviewing those phosphorus control plans to make sure those are implemented. So we're protecting the lake, we're protecting the, you know, our public
So, couple of points. I mean, there are a lot of lots within the watershed that are not in the egg zone. They're rural residential all along, you know, Maple Hill Road, West Auburn Road. That's rural residential frontage. So that's not affected by anything the state's going to do to maybe change the egg zone income that we're talking about. And many of them are not forested because they're former farm fields. But it is true that about 75% of the watershed is forested. And I think the study was rather clear in the best practice of maintaining something close to 75% of forest. And we know that's reforesting of old farm fields, but it's happened a long time ago. So those are now fairly mature forests. And I think when you're looking at this, again, back to the holistic view of this, is that, you know, buffers are fine if you're not having just cut down old trees in order to build a house, and then you got to have your lawn, and then you got to have, you know, your whatever. If you're talking about luxury housing, we know, you know, you got somebody who's going to put a tennis court in, and that's more land, and pretty soon there's a pool, and, you know, so there's a lot of setup here that means a lot of deforestation of land could happen. And that's, I think, got to be somehow embedded into the practice here. It's not just going to be cut down tree time in order to say, and that the septic system and low impact development, I mean, the best low impact development in some places is no development, because that's the low impact. And so I just think it's important to pay attention to the whole study and all of what we actually really know about how to protect watersheds. Not everything is a buildable thing, even if you want housing.
And Mary, if I could just to
Yeah.
elaborate on, I know we focused on LD 1884, but there are a couple of other laws being considered. one of which that looks like it will pass, part of it has passed. But anywhere that a single family home in the town can't treat that differently. And a new one that really was printed on the 28th, I think, on the 7th, on Monday, would require a community to allow up to 4 units anywhere where they are. So those are pressures, I think, that we need to think about.
What do you mean? Yeah. I don't understand that. So let's say the water is rural residential zoning, rural residential on Maple Hill Road. So all along theirs was rezoned in about 1980 to be out of ag zone and into rural residential, and a lot of houses got built on Maple Hill Road at that
Yeah.
time. But there's still plenty of land there. So there are houses there. So that means you could build houses. So how does the single family on the ag zone, how does that work? I guess just using our example here in the water.
So I think the way that it's written, you could certainly build another single family, which you may be able to do already based on the zoning. But the other piece that's being considered is any one of those could build up to 4 units on the property. If you allow a single family, you can go up to 4 family. And then the other piece is that I think would affect the ag zone, the way that it's written. I don't know how it would elect adopted, but anywhere that a single family home exists can build an addition. Not a zone that allows it, but anywhere that a single family. And I think that would affect some of the lots that have non-conforming. So they may also be. There's a lot of moving pieces. I think, and one thing we can do, treat the phosphorus and wastewater.
Can you go back to the? I just wanted to speak to that. The yellow line that's on there is going from. We're into you. So that's the tall peaks here, those are the maximum numbers that we have for those years. I think the more important line to be looking at is the average. So that's the line that's on that slide. That's the average year to year. Yes, there are peaks. Harvest and making it look like there's stability. And really those were the highest year, but when you look at the average, yeah. Ended over those years. And also I think it's important that it stopped at 2013. So after 2011 and 2012, turbidity average over the year went down and did tick back up. And in 2019, I have to follow up and so then turbidity is much lower as well. We're not spikes. So just I think it's important to look at that. Yeah, it just if you look right. So we have as water district for the whole year. And that line is just it.
Is that something you can provide to us to add?
Yeah, we certainly. But it's not accessible online.
Trustees, those are on. But here, really well studied. Any trust in this process. All of this is done. And you've got a lot of people who are unsure.
You need to use the mic. We can't hear you back here.
Sorry.
Yeah, another question about over the years.
Can't hear you.
Okay. Okay. Are those systems from 1800s still in place in early 1900 and 1700?
I'll answer just because John doesn't have the mic, but no, I would guess that the vast majority knows placed multiple times, but not do anything more than the state standard. that existed at the time. These are the date that the home is, how we categorize whether or not the system would have been built to the Lake Auburn standard.
Okay, and is this being brought to planning board next?
A workshop with planning board on Tuesday. No action, but we want to give them all the information. We do have at least one planning board member here tonight as well. Then we expect to have a public hearing at April's.
Okay. And just to Mary's point about changes in turbidity and phosphorus in the lake have been linked to intense, more frequent rain events that we've seen over the past 10 years. I can't say that there's a link to an increase in turbidity because of septic systems in the watershed. Maybe there is, but that's not something that we've seen with our monitoring data.
And we're certainly not trying to say that all of that is from our wastewater.
Say what I was saying before in the mic. The trust is going to be really important in this. And there's been quite a lot of inflammatory rhetoric over the last little while about this. So I think lowering the temperature politically is going to be essential. And things like using all the data will gain trust because there are a lot of people who've actually studied this for quite a while. And making sure that Lewiston is on board. No, most of the people here are not actually interested in a war with Lewiston, even though that rhetoric has been used. We don't live that way in our real lives. We cross the bridge all the time. And it's just another community. So they are our neighbors and our partners. And I think a lot of us want this to be something where everybody is in a win-win situation. Water.
Just want to add to something that she was talking about earlier in reference to the impact that the septic systems may be having in your new design with your extra flow to try to protect it from runoff and all that. Part that I believe you were talking as. I live on Lakeshore Drive, and I can attest to what she said. The amount of water that's actually making it to the lake, whether it's rain, whether it's snow events, is quite dramatic. Yeah, all them little extras that you got there, you know, your 6-inch pipe and all that is definitely going to protect that septic system from leaching more bad things into the ground. But to be totally honest with you, every year I watch rivers flow down my driveway, down alongside Lakeshore Drive, right straight into the lake. Because that's the runoff, and you guys have said it yourself, most of that's coming above, mountain behind me, basically. And all of the stuff that's coming down that hill is making it into the lake. So like she said, although that is a piece, I agree with her 100%. That's a small piece of how much damage is being caused to the lake in reference to protection of the lake.
Earlier, one of the first slides, it said, one of the guidelines was fostering working relationships with the water districts. Has there ever been a meeting with, the water district and the planning board or the council? I said that was one of the guiding statements, and I'm just wondering, are there meetings set up, where everyone is actually talking about having a working relationship about this issue? Because I think there has not been, but I don't know that for sure.
Yeah, I don't know of a joint planning board and water district meeting. I know there's some representation. Appointments made by the council that are up on the board, and we held a meeting 2 weeks ago tonight. And invited the Auburn Water District. I think there's probably more meetings amongst at the staff level.
I think that should be taken off of the guideline. Doesn't seem like it's being fostered. No one is really behind the sail. Say that again. Well, if it's a principle, a guiding principle, it can't just be on paper.
A couple of points I'd like to make. Some of the questions. One of them was buffers around lakes that have to do with development. Wildwood development. I teach installation of septic systems, contractors. One of the, I actually wrote a section of the subsurface rules on wetlands, water bodies, and septic systems. And in that section, there is something, a new requirement for putting in a septic system. You have to be 100 feet away from a lake. There is now a requirement that you cannot disturb the ground 75 feet. Put in that septic system. That was put in there, not because it was. This is how to believe. Some people would say, well, my septic system will between me and the lake, so I can grow the trees and see the lake. So this was in there. So you cannot now disturb the ground within 75 feet of the lake. So that assures a buffer. Again, if there's a replacement system, there's no other place to go, you can't have a failing septic system. One of the other things, I studied forestry in college. I spent 5 years in soils. So I also was a licensed forester. And I'm always curious anyway. So in doing workshops, which I do for Denver, one of the things I have noticed is invasive worm activity, earthworm activity, what they're doing to forested buffers. And it's really deceiving to a lot of people. They think there's a nice forest. This is a perfect buffer. I had a couple of workshops. You know Jeff Dennis? Most people know Jeff Dennis. He's called Mr. Lake. Anyway, they developed all the standards for phosphorus control. I put them on to show them that this, if you've got a hardwood forest in an area that was agriculture, it's not excessively drained, and the odds are there is zero organic dung. And that top upper soil layer is actually dense and compacted. So you get incredible runoff from it. More so in a forested setting than you will from a grass or other vegetative buffer in some cases. If the soil is excessively drained, worms won't grow there because they can't stand it. And if you got a lot of softwoods, they don't like, obviously, softwoods. So if you just have a bunch of hardwoods, you may actually have, what you think is a good buffer, you may have not. You actually get erosion. Roots, I mean, many times I've seen this, roots on the ground are exposed because of topsoil washing off.
Ever walk in the woods? I don't know.
Yeah.
A scientist who's done 25 years of research on our lake, you know, she and her students, they've been all through the woods in the watershed. So these are pretty effective woods.
Nobody's been looking at this earthworm just very recently. It's deceiving. What I'm saying is it's deceiving, and you need to evaluate
I just want to say she's studied these woods, and I think she's a very highly respected scientist published in international scientific journals. So a lot of us have followed her work, and you might be interested in reading some of her research too. She's been in these woods, so she's pretty knowledgeable.
I'm not certainly saying that it isn't. I'm just saying this is something new people did not understand. I took these DEP folks out. I wanted to see this. They said, look at this area here. And they thought it was a wonderful buffer. It wasn't, because they don't look at the quality of the soil condition. This has never been looked at. I'm the only one that I know of that's really been promoting this. That if you don't understand what you've got there, you may think you got better than you have. I'd be happy to take a look at your watershed sometime. I would just explain to you what's out there. And it may be perfect. I'm just saying, be aware, and that you can modify it to make it better. So I'm not saying that. I work with the Belgrade Lakes Alliance, Seven Lakes Alliance, and other groups for the same purpose. It's something that's been kind of under the radar screen.
If you ever want to go walk in the woods in the watershed, Eric knows how to do it. I'm happy to show you.
Yeah, so I'm offering, if Eric and John, whoever want to organize something in the summer, just to tell you, this is what I'm seeing. So I'm not saying it may be perfect. I'm just saying something I've seen all over the state.
I have a question maybe for both of you. How well do the low impact development measures work during the winter? When everything's frozen over, with rain gardens or other types of devices put in?
And I think the same thing is true for buffers.
What do you think?
Guys have mentioned quality of the soil. So let's use an example of somebody that falls in the category there. Have a septic system that was put in the 60s. And they decide, because you said that if the soil doesn't, you even said it in reference to building a house, because you're talking about development and all that. If your soil doesn't meet their requirements, you don't have a lot, you can't build a house. Am I correct in what I heard?
That's the way that the existing ordinances function.
Is that the way the upcoming possible ordinance is going to fall?
So what's being proposed is, I think, better wastewater treatment, but there will also be some instances where it didn't pass before, but now you can bring soils in to make it pass.
So you can replace what's there to meet the standards.
Yep.
Okay. So somebody with an older septic system that goes to an upgrade would have that same opportunity.
They would be required to build it to this new standard, but yes, they can bring soils in.
If needed.
And if a small existing lot, at site constraints, existing home, we're not saying that you can't waiver from those standards. We would work with the plumbing inspector, water district, a way to install a system that is close to meet possible, but not telling somebody.
Okay. Good to know. back to what we were talking about earlier in reference to the impact of septic systems compared to a lot of other things. I definitely think it should be considered that with this type of an ordinance, anybody that needs to upgrade for whatever reason, the cost is going to be, quite high. But the impact improvement isn't really going to impact as high as maybe some of the other things that have been brought up in this meeting, like the runoff. And like I said, I watch this stuff go right into the lake. You talk about a buffer, well, there's not really a buffer. When it runs downhill, goes into a ditch, get down alongside the road, and they got a pipe that goes right into the lake. There's no buffer there. It's coming right off the hill and going right into the lake. But I definitely think impact-wise, with a lot more runoff being the problem, some of the improvements there are probably more important. Not that upgrading septic systems into a better system aren't important as well. I definitely think you guys should be thinking about that as well.
And I know that the Auburn Public Works Department and Auburn Water, Lewiston Water through the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission tried to make improvements along existing roads, correct existing problems. The big one coming up is the Route 4 improvements that will eliminate right up against the lake, and then utilize the boat much more for people that often also be able to reduce the nighttime activity that happens there. This doesn't fix everything, but there's still a need to fix those older existing problems like that situation. I have looked at. I'm guessing if your lot was developed with low impact development standards, that situation would not be allowed to occur.
Yeah, I agree. Also built over 50 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's not really my driveway that's the problem. It's the fact that there's a hill on it. And to what he was saying just a few minutes ago, I can almost attest to what you were talking about the quality of the soil. I got a lot of hardwood around me, yeah, absolutely. But my ground really sucks. Excuse the language, but I can't even really grow a garden unless I want to put in there soil that is made for a garden, which causes a lot more of the run. The thing that I noticed is I've been there 7 years. And when they retard, or should I say, top surfaced Lake Shore Drive about 4 years ago, Auburn Public Works did a lot of ditching. And all that ditching stopped right at Tabors. And I'm past Tabors. So from there on, is your bigger impact as far as your runoff, because your hill is a lot higher. Everything coming down off of Maple Hill and all that stuff is down at that end. And they did do some ditching and they backfilled it with rock and all that. They stopped right at Tabors. And I've got a ditch that, like I said, it's a river. And whether it's a heavy rainstorm, we're coming up to spring, and that's what I'm going to get. I'm going to have a river just flowing right along the side of the road. I mean, yeah, it's right in front of my property, but it's not necessarily my drive.
The other things I do is I work with people on gravel roads to help improve these talking about. Because you're right. One of the, I've been asked to come here talk about septic systems. Obviously, lake water quality is a lot more than septic systems. I believe you guys are going to be dealing with cautious. So if they want, I'll be happy to work with that. One of the things I have been concerned about over the years is basically if you can get a passing septic design on site, you can build a house up. And I think that you should be looking more at the overall suitability of the lot development, because you may have one tiny little bump. You put a septic system on. The rest of the lot is poor quality. Poor quality, you're going to get an incredible amount of runoff. That's a big problem. So you can't even use low impact effectively for lots because you can't go anywhere. So, again, I don't know what Auburn wants to do with whatever I have for expertise, but I can certainly do that sort of thing. I've got 3 or 4 gravel road workshops. I have a lot of thoughts, you know, you look at the site that you're talking about, one came off the hillside. You got concentrated flows, you know, you got a problem, because once it concentrates, unless you spread it out, it's gonna be a problem, because it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's just. I look at things from the top of the watershed back, and I try to stop getting water back around. Concentrate, and end up on somebody's property right near the lake, and you've got to put in these big ditches and just. You get rid of the water before you get there.
I just don't think they should focus on septic.
I don't think that's the intent. I think this is, you know, it's one thing.
Yep.
And then there's also the other thing, which is the element. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is really just focused on septic systems, but the big picture is that if we look at, what the, watershed is doing and what the impacts are, you really gotta start from watershed-based plan. A watershed, you gotta identify where these point source, talking about non-point source pollution, like Auburn, you see it in your home. So you've got to go through, during these high rain events, you've got to develop what's called a watershed-based plan. You've got to identify all the points in the watershed.
I'll tell you what, I don't mind spending $20,000 if I need to replace my septic. Meet your standards,
But
who's gonna fix my land when I
right,
want it?
so this is, I'm just talking about the process, how typically it works in the watershed and how we would address it. And it's not necessarily a city issue only. It has to be in conjunction with the Auburn, Auburn Water District, Lewiston Auburn Water. Everybody has to be able chipping in some money to get the watershed-based plan done, apply for potentially 319 money, Clean Water Act money that addresses these things, and you implement, as Dave mentioned, you implement these best management practices. And, specifically from a design standard, I think about channelized water, level of spreaders, sending that water out, and treating it and spreading it out into the forest. That's a good way of treating that channelized water on high slopes. So that's a direct EMP that we could address that particular issue that you have, you're seeing impacting the lake. That's a bigger conversation. Maybe this is a great place to start that conversation. Where are we? Where are we with the watershed? What is our implementation? What are we? What are we projected to do over the next six years to address non-point source pollution in the Lake Auburn watershed? So,
And I think that's something we can talk with Eric on the water district about. I know the water district, Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission, the City of Auburn, Lewiston Water District have done a lot of work to fix those spot improvements. I'm guessing that the one you're talking about is on a list that is, going to be addressed eventually, but they can't address it.
I was just going to speak to that. Yes, so there was a large diagnostic study that was done in 2013 after there was a fish kill in the lake. So that inventoried the whole watershed, and a lot of sites were identified. That might be one of them that was on that list. That was on Lakeshore Drive. I have to look back at that plan. There's also a 2010 watershed management plan that the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission has, that's shared with Auburn Water District and the City of Lewiston Water Division. That is due to be updated. I actually just talked to consultants last week about that, about a couple state grants that we can use to fund that. And also the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission is funded by Auburn Water District and the City of Lewiston. So there's money going into that specifically to have these types of plans done. And that means boots on the ground and inventorying sites for watershed that are adding a lot of runoff, which is going to the lake. I had a separate question. With these proposed septic ordinance changes, so that could allow for currently unbuildable lots to become buildable. So I'm wondering how you reconcile that with the overall theme of this lake study that came out that says any more development in the watershed would not be good for water quality of the lake.
Yeah, I think it, I think the study said that they didn't recommend increasing the watershed. I mean, we're talking specifically about septic systems here tonight, but we are working on all this. I think that those pressures exist, and not treating wastewater and phosphorus the best way that we can is not responding to those pressures. So I'm not saying that there's going to be more development, whether we do nothing or if we change septic. But right now, we are very likely polluting the groundwater built to the best. There's going to be more development in the watershed, no matter what we're suggesting. Treat the wastewater.
Support what Eric just said. I mean, let's just, for people who know, I mean, there are many roads in the watershed that are already rural residential that have ready to be built. They built the septic system. There's really nothing stopping construction there unless they can, because they can sell lots, and if you can build a septic system. So if you're going to build a septic, build the right one. Right? Because once it's rural residential, there's really no reason why they couldn't build there. If they build the right kind of septic system now, well, it should be the right kind of septic system that's needed.
And the other piece to that this addresses somebody a couple thousand feet away from that, and they're willing to say you can dig a trench for 2,000.
It's a soils. Really,
Exactly. Yeah.
cost is really not.
It wouldn't be allowed, but there wouldn't be motivation.
We're gonna pull out and replace this. We're gonna go 2,000 feet down.
This has been very helpful. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Go back to that diagram with the each bit. So that medium there is what specifically? So it's this media specification right here. So it's a combination of soils, very fine soils, and well drained soils together. Filter media very it represents very closely to full water being underground has more fines. So we're not talking like additional loam on top of it. Filters of education that this gentleman was talking about, not adding an extremely expensive medium, but more costly than what we traditionally be using. Yeah, so there is some cost to this. There will be some organic in the soil media, but it's not.
It's basically.
Yeah.
A subsurface wastewater disposal requires basically that fill. You can't make it any coarser than that. It doesn't allow it. Make it any finer than water will go through it. So it's pretty much what's in the subsurface rules anyway. So by the state.
What David and John were saying, I'm just saying it for the people at home that are not able. The material that's required is very similar to what the state plumbing code requires. John did get pricing from a local aggregate seller. And I believe it was around $48 a yard delivered. Oh, yeah, everything changes over.
You have to use
But
it
it's-
anyway.
And it's a very available material.
In this case, if I understand it correctly, we're building up, which in all probability now, what, 80% of the systems are gonna require a pump? They're fair.
Depends on the topography on the site. I mean, if your
There's no-
system is,
if there's no slope to the lot,
if there's no slope,
we're really talking about introducing the mechanical component that can fail over time. What does that mean for the longevity of the system? What's the downside to this? Because like this gentleman, I'm wondering if, I understand the effort of doing everything we possibly can, but typically we come to these solutions when there's a true identifiable problem. Have we had a problem with homeowners' well water because of failing systems? Or is this just another arrow in the quiver to be responsible so that things don't happen as frequently in the future?
I think it's a recommendation of two Lake Auburn studies, the 2010 Watershed Management Plan, 2021. It doesn't fix everything. It might require some additional pump system. I think that's what John and David were talking about too, is you don't necessarily need a full 36 inches of coverage. Maybe a way to 24 that isn't all that different.
So, a couple of things. One is that the home walls also could be right. So even if you're on a flat lot, you bring in fill material, raise the elevation of the building itself. That's an option
For new homes.
for new homes. That's an option. But again, secondly, as we mentioned before, this media material could be shrunken, potentially could be shrunk down 12 inches. So you would have only 24 inches of actual new material that you would introduce to the field. That still provides that same quality of what we have currently today. So there's a couple of construction techniques there. And then one could say that if you put the system on the ground as we have it designed here, implement the curtain drain and do the other things to protect it. I think we could say with certainty that building a better product is going to last greater over time. Not necessarily the pump, but in a lot of cases, you could build it in such a way where you don't. That night, that would be how it automatically.
And you don't need a pump currently. And probably because you were able to set your system in the ground. That's setting it in. Right, yeah, no, but that's setting it, as David had mentioned, setting it in the ground. Below the biologically active treatment, it's not providing the same level.
Well, I'm sure so.
So I was going to talk about aesthetics. That's typically a 20 by 40 foot pitch field. So you get that amount in your backyard. Yeah, it's needed. Absolutely. It's as a just in case, as a homeowner, to spend that kind of money, look at that type of effort, and make sure you can't look at one that can fail. For just in case, up one third convince me. We've got 275 current systems that might be outdated, is that what I understood? And if they fail, then they would be required to go to standards like this. What is that reporting system? Right now, my understanding is there isn't one. The self-reporting, my system is got a blowout in one of the leach fields. I may choose to address it and I may not. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, we often get complaints and then they have to design a fix with a licensed site. Or that's some current.
Happened a lot in Massachusetts. One of the safeguards, whether true it or not, would be upon sale of property, those things get remedied. As part of the inspection.
That's required in the shoreline zone in Maine now.
Yes, it is.
In most banks won't give a loan unless. So.
Right.
It's not a law, but very few sales take place.
One,
Yeah, they're
one
not
thing,
supposed to, but they still haven't.
one thing that we're proposing is that through an intern this summer, we know where the homes are. We have plumbing permits that show the replacement systems in individual property files, but we don't have a database of connecting that system and the date that it was installed to the home and have that in a place that we view the current age of systems across the country. We're proposing that we get that. Also, the next step would be to start reaching out to property owners. That would be an important part.
I think that would be a good process.
Earlier you said that you wouldn't support or you didn't want to support more than one septic system on 3 or 4 houses. I'd like to know why, because we have some of them and they work very well. And if you were to build a camp that held 100 kids, for instance, you'd have to have a very large septic system for that. So why wouldn't you agree with more than 3 homes on one septic system for the bill right?
I think that's a good question. You know, the basis for that is the concentration of the phosphorus. You really want to try to spread that out. So this was something that we're introducing as a potential change in the ordinance. It doesn't say that whatever we're recommending doesn't say that has to be. Planning board can make an additional recommendation to the council, choose to go another way. But when we're talking about particularly septic systems and septic system direct impact Lake Auburn, we felt that this was probably the best approach for water quality and water protection. As far as the engineered septic system, so largest we're referring to. Specifically for Lake Auburn, I don't think that there's going to be any kind of development in terms of a big engineering system. Doesn't mean that there isn't a situation where we would do it. Right? In that particular case, I think you got to take the design one step at a time. Certainly imposing some of the additional PMPs into the design should be a consideration. So, water, actual rate, water quality. And then I think that Brian made a suggestion as well. You know, this is just suggested language that's going to go to planning board for discussion and workshop. And then they make, you know, eventually it gets to be a recommendation to council. They can introduce any part of this process, you can introduce language to tighten it up, loosen it up, do whatever you need to do to make adjustments. Make it fit best. It's not gonna fit everybody, right? Not gonna be a perfect situation. But with this input, hopefully we get a better result, better product out of it. Certainly, there's a license or certification program for subsurface wastewater inspections. So that could be something that could be introduced language and requirement. That could come out of the planning board. This is what we thought would be agreeable to many people. We can talk an approach, but again, as these conversations occur, some of this stuff might get.
And I think what John was referring to too wasn't necessarily a couple of houses or 2 units in a house sharing a septic. We have multiple lots now in the watershed that don't have the soils to allow for a system. And they all pipe their effluent long distances and site their individual systems in really well drained soils. But you could still have a couple of units or 2 units with a system, single system serving those on a single property. I'd be curious about the shoreline standard that Brian mentioned. Is that something that there would be an appetite for implementing throughout the Lake Auburn watershed? And we have to look at whether or not we could, but at the time of sale is the best time to correct the problem. To make this consistent, have that inspection done. That would give us good baseline data over time. Any other questions or we can go home? Thank you for coming. Thanks for listening. Yep.
No more 3 feet.